Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Lindsay, do you want to come up and join us? Lindsay Correa, one of our staff people, the generation that's coming through, as the Chairman mentioned earlier. And Lindsay's actual specific interest is on the science policy interface. So a lot of her research and connections has been very helpful in the development of the plan. So as we mentioned before, the second draft of the science plan has now been posted. You have a month to review this draft. We certainly don't expect that you've taken a look at it. What we'd like to do this afternoon is just to step through so you know how the plan is structured, what to look for, and we'd like to walk through just a couple of examples of a typical question and how the science plan would be used. So, if we could get the PowerPoint up. Thank you. We thought we would just start with the timeline and where we are. And as we get into this, we'd really like to acknowledge the incredible interest by the programs, the agencies, as well as the scientific community in general. You from the NGOs who've really taken the time to debate within their own programs, within their agencies in the forum, how the science program can be most effective. The Independent Science Board has also weighed in very heavily, and you'll see in your binder their combined take on the first draft. And what you'll see is that many of the points that they raised really reflected your initial responses and questions back in June. So we've received over 900 individual suggestions on that first draft. But what was interesting, as I described last time, our intent in the first draft was to lay out a structure and a strategy for doing science. And many of the details were not included in that plan. What most of the comments focused on, and if you have questions, I could give a brief overview. We broke down those suggestions into 12 separate categories when we developed the second draft. And really there was no negative comment about the overall structure. But there were some suggestions on how to improve that, and so as we go through, I'll touch on those. And by far, most of the questions were saying, where's the details? How does this affect me? How does it help us, if we're an agency, do our jobs better? So if we take a quick look at the time frame, without going back, we kicked this off at the town hall meeting back in October of last year. The second draft is now available, and currently in the Delta plan, it calls for the science plan to be approved by the end of this year. What we're suggesting, because of the fast-moving pace of many things which are going on, what we're suggesting is that if any members of the public, any other agencies want to have follow-up on the second draft, if we could receive those comments by September the 16th, about 3 weeks from now, that would give us the time to compile those various comments and suggestions. You will have also had a chance to go through this second draft. So we can have a very substantive discussion in September about the science plan, how it works, pick up your various concerns. And certainly in the science program, we're very willing to sit down with any of you if you have questions, if you would like us to walk you through the science plan or any of the details, we're very willing to do that. What we feel is that if we can make good progress in September, we would then like to come back with a final draft science plan for your October meeting on October the 24th, with a view to finalizing that very soon thereafter. In some of the comments which we received from the public, and in the June meeting, you also received some testimony about people asking for more time. That was counterbalanced by what we thought were some very positive suggestions from people who have done this at the national level, as well as here in California. And they said you could be discussing all the fine details and you'll never get it right. So their suggestion was to go with an approved plan as soon as possible, but come back a year from now through both the performance metrics, where we have some data to see how the science plan works, but also conduct a third-party survey of the users and the beneficiaries of the science plan to see how it's working for them, and then make updates if appropriate. So that's our suggested timeline. You recommended that we came back just with an overarching problem statement. So what you'll see here is the summary that really the current organization and communication of Delta Science are inadequate for providing the timely, relevant decision support that's needed for policy and management actions in this very dynamic system. So what it's really saying is that science needs to be organized and the support given to that science at a level that's commensurate with the enormous scale of the problems facing the Delta and the people of California. The other thing which has been driving our thought that was really started in that town hall meeting with Director Mark Cowan, Mr. Fiorini as well, who really pointed out that there has to be a better way of making decisions and managing the water resources in California. Are we going to continue to be bogged down in litigation or in action because of disagreements over the science? And so what that spawned is several initiatives across programs, and usually the term is used, collaborative science. And this has been reinforced by recent court rulings and some of Judge O'Neill's rulings in the last few months. So this science plan really facilitates this new approach and this new paradigm. The second draft, just the overview of this. It's broken into 5 chapters. The important one is chapter 2 deals with organizing science. The third chapter deals with the adaptive management for a complex system. Of course, these are all called out for in both the Delta Reform Act and the Delta Plan GP1. The fourth chapter is what is the science infrastructure that we don't have currently that we need to put in place so that we're all working from a common knowledge base and a common approach to science. And the fifth chapter deals with the resources that are required to make this happen. You'll also see at your suggestion a summary of the various actions that finishes after the main text. And then there's 12 appendices which deal with many of the details of how those actions would be implemented. And as you'll see, some of these actions, because we're using some of the ongoing programs as pilot studies, are currently under development right now. The second draft also clarifies the objectives of what we're trying to do. Firstly, we're trying to manage science conflict. So the whole concept behind the science plan, One Delta, One Science, I'd just like to reiterate, it doesn't mean that scientists are going to agree and there's one opinion. In fact, we think that's damaging. Where you really get innovation is when you have different scientific opinions that are genuine, and you have a mechanism to explore these different scientific opinions through research. Secondly, to coordinate and integrate the Delta science in a very transparent manner. A lot of thought was put into science synthesis. Much of the science right now, if you recall, it's siloed or it's fractionated across individual programs or agencies, with one or two exceptions like IEP. But the National Research Council was very clear that we're really missing out on this system-wide approach. The fourth objective gets to Mr. Fiorina's comments back in the town hall meeting. How do we improve the link between policy and science? The fifth objective is to provide the science support for adaptive management. So this isn't dictating the decisions that are made through adaptive management, but what it is doing is organizing the science to inform which actions you may take under adaptive management. And the sixth objective is to organize, maintain, and advance the state of Delta knowledge, including what's being done under science. So to achieve these objectives, you'll see there's 28 actions. That overarching problem we've had in the report is broken down to a sub-problem. what we would like to see as the outcome and the specific actions which are going to be taken to achieve the outcome. A couple of significant changes that we heard both from you and many of the comments has resulted in some changes. So the overall structure has not changed. What we're trying to do here is to create a feedback mechanism where we work out what the overarching science questions are, breaking that into doable chunks of science, doing the science, and then conducting syntheses of that science to improve the knowledge that informs the decisions that were set at the beginning of the process. So it's a continuous feedback mechanism. If you recall, in the first draft, we had a policy science committee. What we heard was there's already too many meetings, there's too many committees. And we see the science program as organizing the knowledge in such a way that it will reduce meeting time. So the Policy Science Forum is convened when there's a need to meet. So you'll see there, I won't go through all of the details now, but there's several very well-defined functions that Policy Science Forum does. Those overarching questions, whether it's feeding the science action agenda or is defining the science which will be conducted over a 4-year time frame, that has to be translated into doable science. So there's a science steering committee there whose responsibility is to translate those big picture policy questions of what's needed into discrete chunks that can then be put out through competitive research, directed research, or addressed in some other issue. The Science Steering Committee is responsible for developing or organizing and directing the science action agenda. This is basically the implementation plan, the action plan for science over a 4-year period. That includes individual agency and program work plans. It includes typical science activities, synthesis, research, monitoring, and modeling. And also, it spawns focused science synthesis activities. The other green box there, so that's the other two parts of the science strategy. We have the science plan, the science action agenda, which is the implementation, what you're actually going to do. And the State of Bay Delta Science is a review of the research, the new knowledge that is being generated as a result of that science action agenda. The Policy Science Forum also does other things. It can be convened about specific issues or actions. So, for example, if we go into a severe drought here, there'll be some tough questions in science which needs to be directed, possibly at very short notice. So that's the mechanism of connecting the science community with some of these big questions. Two just very quick examples here of how the science plan is employed. Of course, the science plan has to cover a very diverse range of questions and problems which will come up across different scales. That's time scales, spatial scales, and it's used for very different uses. So the first example here is picking up on the predation workshop, and we're learning a lot from that process. We've been monitoring that very carefully. And Matt Holland and Sam, who coordinated that, are sitting in the audience if there's any specific questions. So the predation workshop came from the Delta Plan, Chapter 4, and in there you had described workshops to address the stressor impacts. One of those, of course, is predation. So under the Delta Science Plan, under Action 451, there's a section there on synthesis to support science-based decision-making. This is also part of the managing scientific conflict, potentially a very emotional issue. So the appropriate method of delving into this problem and deciding what could be done This was really a decision made by the science program under this new model. It would be one of the big questions that's handed down through the Science Steering Committee. In this case, the most appropriate way forward was through a series of expert workshop panels. The first one was the one held in July. The objectives of that workshop was really exploratory. It was to understand the state of the science, what questions or what is currently being done in terms of research, what has that research shown, and where are the uncertainties. A second possible sequence in these workshops would then be to look specifically at the models. Based on what we know, on hypotheses which could be posed, what is actually our predictive capability in understanding the role of predation? That's really important, because if we can't predict the impact of a certain adaptive management strategy, and the potential response is going to be so small it's lost in the noise, then maybe an adaptive management strategy is not going to get us very far. So we need to understand our predictive capability, the uncertainties surrounding that, and we also need to design the experiments that could be put in place. The third step of this would be an evaluation of the action. So this would be potentially a third workshop. What are the range of actions that could be undertaken? And there would be a very large range. Which makes most sense? Then those actions and the potential implications could be passed back to the responsible agencies that would be making the final decision. So that is the first one. The second one we chose was on a much larger scale and is very close to the heart of our executive director, of course, and the independent science board. And this is, how does this Delta Science Plan inform the adaptive management process? So here we've been working very closely, and we want to build on existing initiatives. You heard from the Restoration Network at your last meeting. We think this is definitely the way to go. The right people are at the table. So what is the science structure that we would like to see put in place that would help the Restoration Network be successful and allow them to make these decisions between potential adaptive management conditions? Another example here is the Collaborative Adaptive Management Team, which is underway right now, which is looking at the remand process between the biological opinions. I would like to acknowledge Leah Winternitz and Val Connor, who are chairing the Collaborative Adaptive Management Team, for seeing how their actions and the science plan work together. So here we're just stepping on the various parts here. If we start with the Delta plan, this need is outlined in GP1. The various elements of the science plan that you would call on to see the implementation of adaptive management would be in several places. The first is early consultation on the 9-step adaptive management process. This gets to Mr. Fiorini's concern that science needs to be at the table right at the beginning. In the plan, you'll see that the way we propose to do this through the science program is to have adaptive management liaisons. Action 3.3. These would be part of a group whose job is to track, to understand what's going on, to give advice on the types of models, what's being done in the region for monitoring data, what can that particular adaptive management program tap into. The second very important part are these restoration frameworks and the water management frameworks, two of the biggest programs that are going to use adaptive management. These frameworks are principles and guidance, and the details of that are given in Action 3.2 and in some of the appendices. A third part of this adaptive management is, if you're doing an adaptive management that might be on a fairly small spatial scale, what is your responsibility for understanding the effect of that adaptive management system-wide, and what can you tap into? So we are proposing, supporting the ability to model future scenarios. So different adaptive management programs can come in and understand the consequence of their project, how it fits into the bigger scheme. There would already be course level analysis available, particularly if you're in one of the 6 priority restoration areas called for in the Delta Plan. The 4th bullet here, originally we had suggested in the first version of the plan an annual adaptive management summit to bring together the different thinking. The advice to which we received, which we thought was really good, is that this shouldn't just be a single summit. There needs to be a place where people can exchange ideas, lessons learned, new tools, new technologies on a much more regular basis. So we are suggesting an annual forum which may or may not be placed around one of the existing science meetings. So I'd just like to remind you of the timeline. We'll be having a detailed discussion here on September the 26th. We will also truly appreciate the very thoughtful insights and comments which are posted on our webpage on the first draft, and we hope to receive more constructive input by September the 16th. But maybe I'll just turn and Rainer, Lauren, Lindsay, did I misspeak or miss any of important points in that very brief overview? That good? So we welcome questions.
Mr. Fiorini.
Dr. Goodwin, there's currently federal legislation calling for predator suppression on a portion of the San Joaquin River. Realizing that the science program will lead to recommended actions for addressing whatever the particular concern is. So in your example, for our purposes today about predation, if there is legislation directing action in a particular area of the Delta, how would the Delta Science Program respond to that if the workshops are not yet completed and so on?
Well, I have a first shot at that. Yeah, so action needs to be taken, but there's a wide range of different measures that could be potentially taken. So I think the purpose and the modeling, what's being looked at now across the agencies, is what is going to be most effective. Particularly if some of those measures could have adverse effects on other species. And so I think what we heard this morning from the BDCP is that understanding those connections broader than particularly a single species is really important. So the way, for example, these workshops, and I'll come back to a minute because we've got a whole range of how we respond that I should have highlighted. So I would say that this process, which is a very open series of workshops where people can express opinions, is a way of corralling and synthesizing that information in such a way that it would help inform what the most appropriate action is. Your question, I think, also what you were getting at, because we're going to have these things coming at us all the time. And one of the things at your urging was sometimes you need to make a decision by Friday, depending on what the issue is. Other things are so complicated, it's going to take decades before we fully understand it. So what you'll see in here is a range of 4 different categories of how we can turn around science and how we package that in order to give a response. So if the answer is on Friday, it may be that the uncertainty is so huge here that really science cannot help you. That is one possible outcome. More likely that's going to happen, you need a very fast answer. It may be there's expertise in the science program through the Science Steering Committee, which is set up to be the scientists crossing all disciplines, irrespective of who they work for. That's a possibility for a very quick read. If that expertise is not there, there's the ability to put a white paper together very quickly. Typically, we do this through expert advisors. So, for example, the question that Chair Eisenberg was asking this morning about the hydraulics. One of the questions there might have been, well, that's okay, you've increased the size of the pipes. What happens if you can get the flow double through that or not? That's something which we could respond to extremely quickly. Back of an envelope calculation. It's there in writing. The next step in that are these series of workshops. Sometimes you can achieve it in one workshop. On the predation, the science, the knowledge is spread around in so many different spaces. It's really been worthwhile to construct this in a way that's going to be very defensible. The next level that we have for resolving this, and we'd like to acknowledge the many different groups, B.J. Miller, many other folks, it's referred to many things, but joint fact-finding. There's many different ways of doing that. So this is where there's a big question. Maybe there's 6 months, a year to respond. It's an extremely complex issue. How do you get an answer when you've got National Academy members on both sides of the argument? There's many ways of doing that. The one which we prefer, because it's proven, is modeled on the NC Center, the NSF Center in Santa Barbara. And so we've called this, sometimes we may use their services, but we've referred to it as DCAS, the Delta Collaborative Analysis and Synthesis Exercise, where you pull the scientists together from both sides. These folks are usually very, very busy. What happens with the NC's model is that you pull the data together and you give that group the resources, the postdocs, the young folks who don't have an axe to grind, to work under the directions of the experts on both sides. And yes, this needs to be mediated. But there's a great track record in really making great strides with that process. So at the end, you have in-depth analysis. This is what we can agree to. This is our uncertainty. And then thirdly, this is perhaps how we suggest we move ahead. So you'll see there's a range of mechanisms that you could call on depending on how quickly the answer is and the magnitude of the problem.
Thank you very much.
And actually, I should ask to please jump in
If you want me to, I could add.